And joining us here now on Fox26Houston.com is Dr. Todd Romero with the University of Houston to talk more Resilient Houston, documenting Hurricane Harvey. Dr. Romero, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So let's first talk about that name, Resilient Houston. Where did it come from and why that
name? Yeah, I'm trying to remember, the hurricane, the time since the hurricane has passed so quickly. And so the origins of the name don't immediately come to mind, but I think a lot of what Dr. Monica Perales and I had talked about in the immediate aftermath of the event when we were talking about this project is just how proud we were of our city, of our fellow Houstonians in reaching out and helping one another, and that the city seems to be a very resilient set of communities and neighborhoods. Now, over time, there's a question of what resilience means and how, when we use terms like Resilient Houston, if it might in some ways make the struggles of communities invisible if we just assume that everyone's bouncing back. Because one of the things that we've learned about the hurricane over time is that lots of people are still struggling with the aftermath 5 years on.
Well, so let's take it back that 5 years before. What was this project? What does this project consist of? In other words, how much of it is dependent on oral histories and firsthand projects?
So the oral histories are the centerpiece and the most important part of the project. At the Center for Public History, we do a lot of different public-facing projects, but there's a critical mass of faculty who are really interested in the discipline of oral history and how we can use it to tell, I think, the important stories of the diverse communities that make up our city. Our city is endlessly fascinating. It's diverse. It's hard to get your arms around, but oral history provides one way of getting firsthand testimony at these really critical moments and challenging moments in our city's history.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that challenge. Take us through the process of when the project started, what inspired it, and what the initial goals were in mind.
Well, I think it started pretty organically. We did what a lot of people do with their friends and colleagues in the aftermath of a disaster. As Gulf Coast residents, we go through these storms every so many years. Obviously, Hurricane Harvey was a signal weather event, but we were reaching out to each other and checking in and seeing how everyone was doing. And we just started talking about our neighbors and our neighborhoods and recognized that this was a really important event to talk about in terms of the human history of it. Not the institutional history, not necessarily the history of the response, but how individual Houstonians and communities experienced it.
Well, and it's funny you say that, you guys are checking in on each other, because there are a lot of professors involved in this project, and even some students, I believe, were involved. Could you tell us a little bit more about that inclusivity?
Yeah. And so we, initially we cast a really broad net, and as is the case with a lot of projects, we're very ambitious. Our ambition in some ways outstripped our ability to execute in terms of our labor pool. But one of the great joys for me and for my collaborators is that the majority of the work was carried through by courses that were, in some cases, undergraduate or graduate courses. We held many public events, oral history harvests, all over the city. And one of the things that I thoroughly enjoy about my work is not only do I get to work within our communities, but I get to work with our talented students. And one of the great things about working at an urban university is that most of our students come from the Houston area. And so they intimately understand the area in a way that, as someone who's lived here for 16 years now, I know a lot more than I did 16 years ago, but I didn't grow up here, and I don't understand the city, I think, in that kind of organic way that many of our students do. And so the work was pushed forward by talented students who most often met in community centers and houses of worship. And we learned a lot, not just about the hurricane itself, but past weather events, about the long history of these communities, about how a tragedy like Hurricane Harvey will, in some cases, reveal not only the resilience of a neighborhood, but also sometimes decades of neglect in some communities, that it reveals disparities in access to education, access to infrastructure, access to a lot of things that many Houstonians, I think, consider just basic facts of life. And so I think it's been very revealing on inequalities.
Well, and Hurricane Harvey impacted all Houstonians. So I hope you don't mind me asking your personal experience and how you were affected by it.
Yeah, so I live in a corner of the East End called Idlewood. We are adjacent to Brays Bayou. Like many Houstonians, I relied on my neighbors. I have some wonderful neighbors. I, both in Hurricane Ike and Hurricane Harvey, worked with my neighbor Steve across the street to clear out storm drains and to try to keep the water flowing out of our neighborhood and back into the bayou. We, like many Houstonians, were initially watching the storm come in, and it was a little delayed in hitting where we were in the East End. And we were thinking that perhaps it wasn't going to be as bad as it was. And once the water really started hitting our neighborhood, the main thoroughfare started to fill up with water. We saw some cars try to drive through that, flood out. At one point in the evening, a car was sort of floating in the bayou, and it was unclear if someone was in it or not. And so my neighbor, tied a garden hose to himself and went out there and, broke the window to see if someone was okay. They turned out to be no one in the car. And in fact, we later learned that the owner of the car was in the group of people who was watching us go out the bayou. We were very fortunate. I mean, it was terrifying. There was a moment where it looked like the water wasn't going to stop rising, and that some houses across the street may flood. Fortunately, it was a break in the weather. And then we spent the subsequent days afterwards helping clear out houses that were flooded in the neighborhood. And I think many Houstonians who were spared the worst of the hurricane, pitched into similar kinds of efforts that were really rewarding for people who were on the helping side. But I think in many ways, people appreciated the assistance, but it also was something that was very hard for them to experience, watching strangers come into their houses and take out sheetrock and carry out cherished belongings. And so, like many Houstonians, we dealt with the problem locally, and I suppose a little bit imperfectly.
Well, what were some of the responses whenever you and other students, maybe even professors, were trying to do community outreach to talk about documenting the hurricane?
I think one of the things that you become really sensitive to is you recognize that when you ask people to share their stories, they're sharing something that's precious. You're asking them to, depending on their experience during the hurricane, to pick at stories that are traumatic, that involve a variety of different kinds of loss, that sometimes can be about the immediate event, but it can also be about a longer history as well. And so I think over time we became better at being sensitive to that and learning how to listen, and learning how to honor those stories that people go through.
Well, were there any moments then, where students maybe were working on a project, or maybe even you yourself, you were working on a project and things just got a little too close to home?
But in numerous interviews, there were times where people would have to take pauses because, sometimes they wanted to recall the story that they were dealing with. Sometimes they just needed time, I think, to share that. I can share one thing from one of the interviews that I found so incredibly powerful. A woman who is an important member, I think very valued member of the Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church community, Gloria Rose, led a lot of the relief efforts that they oversaw in distributing supplies to people in the Third Ward. And when she told her story, one of the things that it reminded me of is the degree to which Gulf Coast people experience these storms over and over again, and the way that they think about the most recent event is often conditioned by the ones that they've gone through in the past. And the way she told her story was in relation to her experience during Hurricane Katrina and relocating to Houston, in some ways losing part of an older life, a chapter of her life and community, and then being made whole when she came to Houston and joined Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church. And she talked a lot about her relief work as an act of service, of giving back to her church and community, because she had been granted the same treatment when she came here in the aftermath of that other storm. And so those kinds of things I found deeply, deeply moving, and I felt honored to be in the presence of someone that would share that kind of story with me. And also very much in awe of the work that so many of the community organizations did in our city to support the neighborhoods and people that live around them.
Well, and we're 5 years now into Hurricane Harvey, but from a historian's perspective, what are some of the biggest takeaways that at least those in the contemporary sphere should be mindful of, so that, excuse me for the pun, but we can avoid history repeating itself?
I guess for me, the single biggest lesson that I took away from doing the interviews is the degree to which natural disasters are conditioned by human choice, and that the way in which individual communities experience those disasters is shaped by the resources that they get prior to the disaster. In the case of some neighborhoods, the neglect that they've suffered over decades, and so one of the things that I think natural disasters can reveal to us in the aftermath of the storm, not as just the number of inches of rain that fell, or how many houses were damaged, or how many billions of dollars it cost, but it's a real measure of what communities we have chosen as a society to support and what communities have been neglected in terms of education, in terms of access to work, in terms of access to infrastructure, healthcare, and all the rest. And so, in that way, it was really powerful to me how much I learned about what some communities suffered, and how it was shaped by that history.
Well, and the future's unwritten, and I don't want us to get into speculation, but 50 years from now, what do you think researchers will take away from these archives?
I'm hoping that what they'll take away from it is, if you're to understand any event like this, that you need to start with the communities and how they experience it. That the way in which government officials think about the response to a disaster should be shaped by how those communities fit within a city and how they're attached to the place. And sometimes when we talk about buying up houses and moving properties and institutions, that might seem like an expensive endeavor, but it's also one that can be complicated by people's attachment to place and what that place means. And so when people talk about a neighborhood no longer being viable because it's too close to a bayou, I think understanding the history of its institutions, whether a lot of the interviews we did were in the heart of Jewish Houston, and the importance of the way in which that greater Meyerland area was central to institution building in the city, that the solutions that politicians and engineers think about when they approach those problems needs to be conditioned by the needs of those neighborhoods. Similarly, when we did interviews in other parts of the city, one of the things I was struck by, I'll give you an example. We did a number of interviews with people from Kashmir Gardens and from the Fifth Ward. People spent a lot of time not just telling us about the storm, but telling us about the neighborhood and about what the neighborhood means to them and how we should understand the neighborhood. And it's part of what I mentioned earlier about respecting the preciousness of the stories the people are sharing, that they're sharing their story, but they're also telling us a little bit about how important that neighborhood is as a place and what it means to those families that have lived there and made their lives together.
It's very tragic. What are what does the future now hold for the rest of documenting Harvey, Resilient Houston?
Well, we're still building out our website, adding interviews to it, getting interviews transcribed, and we still have students that are working on it. So we had, I guess you could say, front end work where students were conducting interviews, and now we have talented group of students who are pushing the project forward and helping us design websites, putting together snippets of the interviews, either in audio or in video, because one of our goals was to make the oral histories not just available to researchers and specialists, but that's something that an ordinary Houstonian can simply go on their phone, their iPad, or tablet, or a computer, and click on the map that we've put together and find stories that tell at least one slice of the experience in maybe their own neighborhood, or maybe in a neighborhood unlike theirs.
So where can the ordinary Houstonian go? You said there was a website?
Yeah, I don't remember the URL off hand, but if you, I suspect if you Google Resilient Houston documenting Hurricane Harvey at the Center for Public History at the University of Houston, you'll find it there. And I can certainly share the address with you offline.
Of course, and I'll make sure it's at the bottom of the story. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we conclude?
Oh, just that one of the things that I came to through doing this work is a greater appreciation for the city, and it's helped me love my community all the more.
Absolutely. Dr. Todd Romero with the University of Houston, talking Resilient Houston, documenting Hurricane Harvey. Thank you so much for sharing your insight with us.
Thank you for your time, Ahmed.